Sometimes one night changes not only your plans, but your entire life, especially when it sparks a question two friends have been afraid to ask out loud. Alex had never been the type to overthink logistics. That's why, when Nick suggested driving up to Boston for a small acoustic festival, he packed in 15 minutes. They'd done it before, road trips with little planning, improvised playlists, and the kind of conversations that lasted for hours or ended in comfortable silence. But that Friday, the moment they stepped into the hotel lobby, something shifted. The woman at the front desk glanced at her screen, frowned, and explained that due to a booking error, there was only one room left for them. One bed. Alex had looked at Nick, expecting at least a raised eyebrow, but Nick only shrugged, as if the arrangement didn't matter. They took the key and headed upstairs without another word. The hallway felt longer than it was. Alex wasn't sure if it was the hum of the vending machine or the quiet behind them that made him aware of every step. When they opened the door, the bed dominated the room. Nick dropped his bag, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the mattress with a casualness that should have been familiar, except it wasn't. Alex sat on the edge, scrolling through his phone as if the glow could distract him from the awareness of Nick's presence a few feet away. They had shared cramped spaces before, tents, couches, back seats of cars, but tonight the air felt heavier. He told himself it was the long drive, the looming performance the next day, anything except the truth he was trying to avoid. The evening moved quickly. They grabbed a late dinner nearby, wandered through streets lit with strings of festival lights, and returned to the hotel. By then, Alex's mind was racing in quiet loops. Back in the room, Nick stretched out again, claiming one side of the bed without hesitation. Alex turned away before lying down, pretending to check messages he wasn't reading. The silence between them wasn't the comfortable kind they used to have. It was taut like a thread stretched too far. The hum of the air conditioning became background noise to his thoughts. Every shared laugh they'd had lately, every time Nick's hand had brushed against his in passing, every look that lingered a fraction longer than necessary. Sometime after midnight, Alex felt movement. The faint touch of fingers against his arm froze him in place. It could have been accidental. The bed was small, but the contact burned into his awareness. Then, through the quiet, Nick murmured something. At first it was unclear, then distinct, his name. Just that. Alex didn't sleep after that. He stayed still, eyes open in the dark, wondering whether it had been a dream, a slip of the tongue, or something heavier. In the morning, Nick moved around the room as if nothing had happened, tossing casual questions about breakfast. Alex answered without looking up, holding the weight of the night in his chest. They left the hotel for the festival grounds, but the day passed in fragments. Nick seemed distracted, glancing at Alex when he thought it wouldn't be noticed, then looking away quickly. The performances blurred together, the music too soft to cut through the haze in Alex's mind. He tried to focus on chords, on lyrics, on anything but the touch and the whispered name. By the time they returned to the hotel that evening, the space between them felt like something alive. They went through familiar motions, Nick scrolling on his phone, Alex tuning his guitar, yet each small sound felt amplified. No one mentioned the night before. No one dared. Lying in bed again, Alex realized the question forming inside him wasn't whether Nick had meant anything by it. The question was what he would do if he had. Back in New York, the rhythm of their friendship fractured almost immediately. Alex noticed it first in the pauses, replies to messages coming hours later, stripped down to single sentences. Invitations to meet were met with vague excuses. Nick was still there on social media, posting from cafes they used to visit, tagging new faces in places that once belonged to just the two of them. At first, Alex told himself it was coincidence. People got busy, schedules shifted, but after the third unanswered call, the justifications started to sound hollow. He replayed the Boston weekend in his head, combing through every detail. The hotel lobby, the bed, the whisper. He asked himself if it had been real, or if fatigue and wishful thinking had twisted it into something it wasn't. The following week, he saw Nick once, a chance encounter outside a record store. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Nick smiled, but it wasn't the easy kind Alex knew. It felt practiced, a gesture meant to close a conversation before it began. They spoke about nothing, the weather, the noise of the city, and then drifted apart as if the moment had no weight at all. Days stretched, and the absence became more deliberate. Nick's responses were shorter, the kind you send to keep an interaction alive without feeding it. Alex caught himself staring at his phone late at night, drafting messages that he deleted before sending. He didn't want to be the one chasing someone who had already decided to step away. On a Wednesday evening, after ignoring the urge to write for nearly a week, Alex gave in. He kept the message simple, asking if everything was fine between them. 3 hours passed before the reply arrived. Yeah, all good. Just busy. He read it twice, trying to find meaning in the plain words. All good felt like the opposite of what was actually happening. By Friday, the space between them felt measured. Alex saw Nick tagged in a photo at a rooftop bar, sitting beside a tall guy with an open smile, leaning in close the way people do when they've already crossed some invisible line. The image stuck with him through the weekend. He didn't know if it was jealousy or the simple sting of being replaced, but it lodged somewhere deep. Sunday afternoon, walking across campus, Alex spotted Nick coming out of the library with the same man. They were talking casually, hands in pockets, moving in sync. For a second, Nick's eyes met his. The smile that followed was polite, almost formal, no trace of the history between them. Alex nodded in return and kept walking. That night, he tried to work on a song, but couldn't get past a broken chorus. The melody fell apart halfway through, words scattering before they could land. He left the notebook open on the desk and sat in the dark, the unfinished lines echoing the unfinished conversation that had been hanging over them since Boston. In the days that followed, Alex stopped reaching out entirely. He thought about sending one last message to demand clarity, but couldn't find a way to do it without sounding either angry or desperate. So he let the silence grow, telling himself it was better this way. If Nick wanted to close the door, Alex wouldn't hold it open. But the truth was harder to ignore at night, when the city noise dipped just enough for thoughts to get louder. That single moment in the hotel, the whisper, the touch, had burrowed into his mind. It wasn't just about what happened. It was about what it had revealed, a crack in the foundation, or maybe a doorway, and the unspoken decision to turn away from it. He began avoiding the places they used to go together, not because he feared running into Nick, but because he didn't want to see them without him. The empty chair across a cafe table felt heavier than he cared to admit. He tried replacing those spaces with new ones, but even in unfamiliar streets, he found reminders, a song playing from an open doorway, a phrase on a chalkboard menu, the scent of roasted coffee that belonged to their shared mornings. 2 weeks passed. No calls, no texts, no sign that Nick wanted to change the course of things. Alex told himself that if this was how it ended, then so be it. Still, there were moments when his hand hovered over his phone, one tap away from undoing the silence. But he never pressed send. By then, the festival in Boston felt like something that had happened in another lifetime. Yet the memory of that night kept circling back, not as a romantic fantasy, but as a knot he couldn't untie. It was the kind of moment that demanded either an honest conversation or permanent erasure, and right now, they had chosen neither. The waiting, Alex realized, was its own kind of answer. The note arrived without ceremony. A barista slid it across the counter with a receipt, saying someone asked her to pass it along if he came in. Alex knew the handwriting before he unfolded it. The message was brief, a time, a place, and a line that needed no decoration. Meet me at the Red Door tonight. No apology, no explanation. The economy of it told him everything. Nick didn't trust his voice yet, but he was finally ready to stand in the same room as the truth. Alex didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. The decision had already formed before he finished reading. He pocketed the paper and tried to continue with his day, but every task dissolved. The guitar stayed in its case. The emails sat untouched. He walked because walking was the only thing that kept the pulse steady, and even that wore thin as evening began to pull the light down toward the river. He thought about not going, just to prove to himself that he could, and the idea evaporated as quickly as it came. He was going. The Red Door had a way of looking more ordinary when you needed it most. It was a side entrance to the kind of cafe people forgot until they needed somewhere quiet. For years, it had been their refuge, the place where arguments slowed and ideas sharpened. Standing across the street, Alex watched the door as if it might vanish. When the clock ticked close to the agreed time, he crossed, pulled the handle, and stepped into the hush they had always claimed as theirs. Nick was already there, seated at the back, hands folded in that deliberate way he used when he was trying to keep them from shaking. He rose halfway, then sat again, as if formalities had no place tonight. Alex took the chair opposite. The room held its familiar sounds. A machine sighing in spurts from the kitchen, the soft clink of a cup somewhere behind the counter, the city thinning to a low murmur beyond the walls. There were other patrons, but they kept to themselves. The two of them did the same for a moment, letting the silence do the introduction. Nick began with the sentence Alex had expected, but still refused to rescue him from saying. He admitted he had disappeared. He said he knew it hurt, and that he had no excuse that would sound good out loud. He described the days after Boston like a set of closed doors, one labeled fear, another labeled routine, and a third with no label at all, the one he had walked through because it meant he didn't have to name anything. Alex listened and didn't interrupt. He had asked for words. He would take them all. Nick said he kept replaying the night, the small bed, the accidental touch, the names spoken into dark. He had tried to convince himself that it meant nothing, that it was a trick of exhaustion, that Alex had imagined it. But every time he rehearsed the version where it didn't matter, something inside him refused to accept the lie. That's when, he admitted, he started to avoid messages. He thought the space would starve the feeling. Instead, It fed it until it became the only thing he could hear. He brought up the man from the library. It wasn't a confession, not really. He explained that he had said yes to someone easy because saying yes to Alex felt like stepping into a room with no exit, and the idea terrified him. The admission landed without theatrics. Alex absorbed it, noted the honesty, and recognized it for what it was, a failed attempt to reroute a current that was moving one direction only. He didn't flinch. The sting had already come and gone on a Sunday sidewalk. When Alex finally spoke, he kept it spare. He said the silence did more damage than any truth could have. He said he had spent nights trying to decide if the moment in Boston was a story he had written alone. Nick shook his head at that, a quick, unguarded movement that sent a quiet relief through the table. Alex finished by telling him he hadn't come for an apology. He had come to hear whether they were about to end something or begin honestly. They stayed with the plain language. Nick said he didn't know how to be different and was trying anyway. He said he had learned to keep certain parts of himself compartmentalized, not because he was ashamed, but because it felt safer to be half real in public. He wasn't sure how to stop. Alex told him that staying half real had already dragged them into a kind of dishonesty neither of them could maintain. If there was anything to keep here, it would need to be kept in daylight. Their coffees arrived, set down by a staffer who knew them well enough to ask nothing. The presence of the cups made the meeting feel less like a crisis and more like a choice. They sipped, and the talk settled into a steadier current. They traced the arc from their first shows and late-night drives to the hotel corridor that felt too long. They admitted how each had chosen silence for different reasons. None of it sounded dramatic when spoken plainly. It sounded human. Nick said he worried about what would happen when friends started asking questions, when family saw them in a context that wouldn't allow easy denials. He wasn't predicting rejection, but he had learned to expect the friction that comes with changing a story people think they already know. Alex didn't sugarcoat it. The friction was coming, but the cost of avoiding it would be higher. It already paid some of it. Nick nodded, grateful for the lack of pretense. At some point, the owner locked the front door, but gave them a wave that meant they could stay. The room thinned until it was theirs. This wasn't a reconciliation. There had been nothing official to reconcile. It was the first clear conversation they'd had, free of the static that had followed them all summer. They tested the idea of labels and agreed to put it aside. The urgency wasn't to name the thing. The urgency was not to betray it. Alex described the unfinished song that wouldn't resolve. He realized, as he said it, that he had been writing around the truth to keep from staring at it. Nick's mouth tugged into a shape that would have been a smile on any other night. He admitted that he had, more than once, drafted a message he never sent, a meeting here, under this roof, because he trusted the way the place made them tell the truth. He had crumpled the drafts, worried that the ask itself would be unfair. Then the memory of the whispered name returned and made the calculation feel irrelevant. They took stock of the damage. It wasn't catastrophic, just messy. A handful of unanswered texts, a public near-sighting, a photo with someone who didn't matter. Both agreed there was nothing to clean up except the habit of folding themselves into shapes that didn't fit. They could stop doing that now. The relief that followed was modest but real. It showed up as air moving easier in the lungs, as water swallowing the last of the ice. There were almost no promises. They didn't plan a future. They planned tomorrow, which was to say they would text in the morning and meet after work and tell the truth if one of them felt the old urge to retreat. That was the only rule, no vanishing. Alex said he could live with that. Nick said he needed it. When it was time to leave, the city had gone quiet in the way it does between one day and the next. The owner handed them the side key and told them to drop it on the counter when they were done. They stood, the chairs scraping softly, and moved toward the red door together. Alex tucked the note back into his wallet, like it was a receipt from a necessary purchase. Nick lingered just long enough to steady his breath. They stepped outside. On the sidewalk, they didn't touch. The distance between them had changed shape, though. It was no longer a gap to measure, but a stretch to cross at a pace they could manage. Nick said he was sorry for choosing silence. He also said he wasn't sure he would never be tempted by it again, but if he was, he would say so instead of disappearing. Alex accepted that because it was honest, and because he preferred a difficult truth to a polished lie. He said he could live with imperfect if it stayed present. They walked toward the corner where their routes split. At the light, they didn't perform the old script of one more joke or one more deflection. There was no need. They had already decided to keep the door open and step through without asking what was on the other side. It was a simple commitment, and it was enough to carry them the block they needed. Back in his apartment, Alex placed a note on his desk and opened the notebook that had refused to cooperate. The unfinished chorus waited, stubborn and thin. He didn't try to write it better. He wrote it true. The lines arranged themselves without resistance, the way certain truths do when they are finally allowed to exist in the same sentence. He thought of the single bed, the whispered name, the city's indifferent traffic, the cafe, key cooling on a counter. None of these images needed ornament. They were instructions. Before he slept, he sent a message that contained no questions, just a time and a place for tomorrow. Nick replied with a word that meant yes. There would be more difficult days ahead, and maybe new kinds of silence to navigate, but the night had done its work. The question they had both avoided had been brought into the open, and it had not destroyed them. It had given them something steadier to stand on. The red door had not promised anything. It had only allowed them to decide. That was enough. The morning after the red door, they kept the agreement to show up. Alex chose a bench by the river where the wind cut through conversation and forced sentences to stay lean. Nick arrived on time and admitted, before they'd finished their coffee, that his silence had come from fear. He didn't dress it up. He said he had felt the ground tilled in Boston and thought the only way to keep what they had was to step back from the edge. He had believed distance could protect the friendship. Instead, it hollowed it out. Alex said the damage wasn't the feeling, but the hiding. He explained he had spent 2 weeks revising a memory that didn't want to be revised, testing it for cracks, trying to reduce it to a misunderstanding. Each attempt made him feel smaller. He wasn't accusing. He was describing the cost. Nick listened, hands tucked into his sleeves, and told him he had built a reflex years ago. Whenever something important threatened to change shape, he stalled until it passed. This time it hadn't passed. They agreed to keep the day simple. No big declarations. No negotiations over what to call each other. The only rule was to say what was real and accept that real might change week to week. They walked without destination, trading unpolished truth. Nick said he had been surprised by his jealousy in the months before Boston. Small things that never used to bother him. A stranger laughing too loudly at Alex's jokes, a late-night text from someone he didn't know. He had been embarrassed by the pettiness and had decided not to mention it. Now he admitted that silence had been the start of the drift. Alex said he had noticed the shift too and had mirrored it, joking less, holding back stories, setting himself to neutral to avoid making anything worse. They both recognized how that posture had suffocated the friendship they were trying to preserve. They started practicing honesty the way people learn a new instrument, slowly, with mistakes. On the train downtown, Nick said he was scared of being seen in a way that would invite commentary he wasn't ready to manage. He referred to family dinners where certain subjects were skipped and to an office culture where curiosity could be performative. He said he didn't want to turn his life into a statement. Alex understood. He said he didn't need anyone's announcement. He needed presence and a refusal to disappear. Nick said he could try that. At lunch, Alex voiced a doubt he hadn't said aloud. He feared wanting more than Nick could give. He didn't want to draw maps and then be resentful when the route changed. Nick didn't promise anything he couldn't guarantee. He said he wanted to stand next to the truth and see how it fell over time. He asked if that was enough for now. Alex said yes, because the alternative had been no contact at all. They built small habits. When something uncomfortable surfaced, they named it immediately, even if clumsily. If one of them felt the urge to withdraw, he sent a text that said as much. If a message went unanswered for hours, there was a follow-up later explaining why. It was inelegant, and some days it felt like tedious accounting, but the accumulation created a steadiness neither had expected. The first test arrived sooner than either wanted. A mutual friend hosted a gathering, and the guest list included people who loved to watch dynamics shift. On the way there, Nick said he was anxious about the scrutiny. Alex suggested they decide nothing in advance. No rules about where to sit or how to stand. Only that they would check in once during the night. At the party, they drifted to different circles. Alex noticed the familiar game of people measuring distances and drawing conclusions. True to plan, Nick found him by the kitchen after an hour and reported that he was fine, but getting tired of questions built like traps. So, are you two still attached at the hip? Alex said they could leave at any time. Nick shook his head. He wanted to stay, but he appreciated the exit hanging in the air. Later, while saying goodbye, someone made a pointed joke about road trips and hotel rooms. Alex let it pass. Nick didn't. He said, matter-of-factly, that people could find better material. The joke died. On the walk home, he confessed that speaking up cost him less energy than pretending he hadn't heard. It felt like progress. Another test came from the inside. Alex played a small set at a bar where the sound always ran a little hot, and nerves could warp a chorus if you let them. He included the song that had refused to resolve and discovered mid-performance that the line now carried weight instead of static. Afterward, a stranger asked who the song was for. Alex said it was for anyone who ever mistook silence for safety. Nick, waiting near the stage, heard the answer and felt a mixture of relief and exposure. On the sidewalk later, he admitted he wasn't ready to be the subject of art, even if no names were named. Alex told him he didn't write to exhibit him. He wrote to stop lying to himself. They stood on that difference until it settled. Nick said he could live with it, as long as they kept talking when the songs made him uneasy. Alex agreed. They also met friction in smaller places. A text from the tall guy reappeared with a friendly invite. Nick showed it to Alex before he replied and said he planned to decline without explanation. Alex told him he didn't know a performance of guilt. He could just say he was busy. Nick said that sounded like the old version of himself. He preferred a clean no. He sent it, closed the thread, and felt something unclench. On a Sunday call with family, the topic of dating surfaced in that probing style that pretends to be casual. Nick answered in general terms, but didn't deflect. Afterward, he sent Alex a message saying the conversation had gone better than expected and worse than he'd hoped. He wasn't ready for specifics, but he also wasn't hiding. Alex replied that this counted as a win, and Nick agreed. They talked about boundaries, the kind that made room rather than drew fences. Alex said he didn't want to wake up each morning wondering whether the ground had shifted overnight. Nick said he couldn't promise he would never panic, but he could promise to name it if he did. Alex said that naming it was the difference between a stumble and a vanishing act. They both knew which one had nearly ended them. With time, the tension changed quality. It no longer hummed like a thread. It pulsed like effort. They noticed how tired truth-telling can make you at first, the way muscles ache when they haven't been used. They noticed, too, how quickly the body adapts when the work is consistent. A week with no evasions felt radical. 2 weeks felt normal. They kept delaying the question of labels on purpose. Friends tried to help with casual taxonomy. Are you together or what? And they deflected without sarcasm. They told each other privately that the rush to define belonged to everyone else. What they were building didn't need a headline to be real. They agreed that if a name ever helped rather than trapped them, they would use it. Until then, the only commitment was to keep the conversation alive. In quieter moments, doubt returned, but it didn't dominate. Alex still had jolts of worry that he was leaning harder. When that happened, he said so, and Nick met it with reassurance or admitted he was behind and would catch up. Sometimes the roles reversed. Nick would wake with the old urge to bunker down, and Alex would ask for a simple yes to breakfast. Nick found that choosing a small yes punctured the larger fear. The day moved forward. One night, they walked past the cafe with the red door and didn't go in. They didn't need the place as a guarantee anymore. The note stayed on Alex's desk, not as a relic, but as a marker. This was the night we stopped letting suspense write our script. He looked at it sometimes before rehearsals, not for sentiment, but for calibration. He had learned the difference between performing calm and having it. By the end of the month, they could sit together in public without calculating the optics. They were not reckless. They were simply done apologizing to themselves for wanting to be in the same frame. There were still choices to make and rooms to enter with care, but the central agreement held. They would not rush to answers or retreat from questions. When friends pressed for clarity, they answered with what was true that week. When family asked for definitions, they offered honest limits. No one got a story that didn't exist yet. This, they realized, was its own form of commitment, to stay present in the uncertainty, to pick each other up from the old habits of delay and disguise, and to keep moving without pretending they were somewhere they were not. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a practice. It didn't make a headline. It made a life. And for now, that was enough. The shift didn't arrive as a proclamation. It settled into the calendar, small entries replacing the long blanks that had once signaled withdrawal. Mornings came with simple decisions. Meet for coffee before work, send a message at lunch, leave the evening open in case the day had been heavy. Nothing was dramatic. That was the point. They were building something that could survive ordinary time. Trust took the shape of routines. Alex learned that Nick was steadier when he knew what the next 12 hours looked like. Nick learned that Alex wrote better when he wasn't bracing for silence. They made room for both truths. On days when practice ran late, Alex warned ahead. On days when the office swallowed Nick whole, he sent a brief note that said he would surface after 9. The messages weren't romantic. They were signs of care measured in minutes. The hotel key lived in a small dish on Alex's desk. He didn't treat it as an altar. It was a reminder. Chance had forced them into a narrow space, and instead of pretending it hadn't happened, they had chosen to walk forward. When doubt pressed in, he let the metal sit in his palm for a second and put it back. The gesture steadied him more than any affirmation could. They shared mornings in a way that demanded no commentary. Sometimes it was the bench by the river. Sometimes the same cafe where staff knew their orders and didn't ask questions. They learned to read each other's energy in fewer words. If Alex arrived quiet, Nick understood it meant he was revising a song in his head and would resurface when the draft was done. If Nick sat with arms crossed and eyes on the street, Alex recognized the posture of someone gearing up for a difficult call. He didn't try to fix it. He stayed near. Support showed up in tasks. No one applauds. Alex carried equipment to a cramped venue and found Nick already there. Cables coiled, set list taped down, the annoying hum in the monitor traced to a loose jack. Nick didn't announce the help. He preferred the satisfaction of problems solved before they became performance. In return, Alex learned the cadence of Nick's deadlines and sent food when meetings ran through dinner. He didn't attach notes that made a show of generosity. The delivery spoke for itself. They were careful with each other's histories. Nick began to talk about the years when avoidance had felt like survival, not preference. He explained how easy it was to confuse discretion with disappearance, and why he had chosen the latter too often. Alex shared the catalog of misreads he had collected over time, the times he had mistaken attention for interest or friendship for a promise no one had made. They didn't trade confessions for drama. They used them as context so they'd know where the tripwires were. Friends noticed the change and reacted in predictable ways. Some teased with warmth. Some studied the new distance, or lack of it, as if determining whether it was temporary. A few tried to force definitions, the way people do when ambiguity makes them nervous. Alex and Nick declined without defensiveness. They said, when pressed, that nothing needed a name to be real. The line worked because it was true. Family moved more slowly. Nick found that patience helped. He didn't set up confrontations or stage announcements. He let people witness the pattern, the consistent companionship, the absence of hiding, the calm. When questions came, he answered plainly and stopped before he crossed the boundary of what he was ready to discuss. He reported back to Alex that the conversations felt less like battles and more like weather, uncomfortable at times, but passing. Alex told him that endurance counted as progress. They agreed not to let other people's deadlines govern their pace. The city offered tests without trying. A stranger at a bar assumed they were brothers and made a careless comment about finding the right girls. Nick corrected him gently and moved on. The interaction lasted 10 seconds, but afterward he pointed out that 10 seconds used to cost him a day. Now it barely registered. Alex marked the difference and didn't make it a ceremony. The win was already baked into the way the evening continued. 2 drinks, 1 set, a short walk home. There were still frictions. Alex caught himself measuring Nick's responses against a standard that neither of them had agreed to, and he said so. Nick admitted he was still learning not to flinch when he felt watched. They corrected course, without turning each admission into a summit. The corrections added up. The old panic found fewer places to land. Work bled into their life in ways that helped rather than crowded it. When Alex booked a small tour of city bars, he planned a route to minimize stress. He checked sound and daylight when he could, and Nick handled logistics with an efficiency that surprised them both. The venues were modest, but the rooms listened. After one show, a young musician asked Alex how to write about something you're afraid to name. Alex told him to write around it until the circle felt dishonest, then step inside. Nick heard that answer and understood how far they had come from the night they couldn't look a question in the eye. They didn't pretend everything belonged to the two of them. They kept separate friendships, separate hours, separate retreats when solitude was necessary. The difference was that solitude no longer functioned as escape. It was part of the rhythm they were designing. If a day passed without seeing each other, it didn't trigger the old recoil. It only prompted a check-in later, a sentence or two that said, "Still here." On an ordinary Tuesday, Alex recorded the song that had once refused to settle. He didn't announce the session. He just sent the file after and said he thought it was done. Nick listened on the subway and wrote back that the track sounded like someone letting air in. He meant it as a compliment. Alex understood. He also understood that the song belonged to a moment they had already outgrown, and that was exactly why it worked now. The hotel key remained in view, not to anchor them to the past, but to keep their origin honest. It had unlocked nothing in Boston except the facts they were now willing to live with. They had crossed an invisible line long before the booking error, and the night had simply lit it up. The key's only job now was to keep them from rewriting that history to make it prettier or safer. They didn't need pretty or safe. They needed true. The absence of labels stopped being a performance. It was just the shape of their days. If someone asked, they answered in terms of practice. We plan together. We show up. We don't vanish. We tell the truth sooner than later. The description satisfied most people and irritated a few. They let irritation sit where it belonged. Months accumulated. The small choices hardened into a scaffold that didn't wobble when stress shook it. When deadlines crowded Nick or travel pulled Alex out of town, the connection held. They had learned to inform instead of apologize, to request instead of hint, to admit instead of manage. The skills were not glamorous, but they did the work. Once, passing the hotel on a drive through Boston for a gig, Alex mentioned the room as a waypoint rather than a wound. They didn't stop. They didn't need to. He joked that they should have left a thank you note at the desk for the reservation error. Nick said the note had already been written, just not on paper. They let the road take them past the building without ceremony and reached soundcheck on time. On a final night of the tour, after a set that ran clean, Alex looked at Nick waiting by the stage and felt something settle that had been hovering for months. He recognized it as relief, but not the abrupt kind you get after a crisis. It was the steady kind you earn by showing up daily. After loadout, they walked to a diner and split a plate without pretending they weren't tired. No declarations, no vows. Just the knowledge that they had moved from improvisation to composition and that the piece held. Back in New York, Alex placed the hotel key in a small envelope and wrote a date on it. He wasn't retiring the symbol. He was giving it context. They were no longer the people who needed a reminder not to run. If fear visited, it found fewer chairs. They kept the rule that had saved them. Don't rush to the answer. Don't run from the question. Everything else, mornings that began on time, messages that arrived when promised, the quiet pride of tasks done for each other without fanfare, grew out of that. What they had didn't require a headline or a badge. It required attention. They gave it daily. And the life that formed around that attention, steady, present, unperformed, was exactly what they had been trying to reach since the night a door closed behind them and asked, without words, whether they were ready to stop pretending. They were.